In this episode of In the Loop, the overturning of Roe v. Wade might have happened months ago, but we explore the ripple effects that are still being felt, leaving clinics across the country in limbo.
I can't run a clinic without knowing what services I can provide and the staff that's required for it.
Plus, some cities have tossed around the idea of making public transportation free for everyone. But what would that really entail? This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. Those stories are coming a little later in the show, but we're going to kick things off with our top story. This past November, major cities in China saw something very unusual: widespread protests directly against the ruling party. They were triggered in part by a deadly fire in Urumqi, the capital of the Xinjiang region. The city had been under a strict COVID lockdown since August as a part of China's zero COVID policy. There was intense online speculation that the strict stay-at-home lockdowns were to blame for the deaths in that deadly fire, though it's not confirmed if the residents were actually locked inside. We reported on the growing resentment of zero COVID policies back in the spring when Shanghai fell into a months-long lockdown and scenes emerged online of protests and outcry coming from residents' windows.
5分钟前头，俺们叫我没几个了，现在突然之间，所有人都叫了。
Months later, many across the country are still in these lockdowns, though some restrictions are lifting. Eventually, the November protests were dispersed by authorities, and the government finally conceded to make a number of changes to the policy, like making travel easier and restricting the lockdowns to only high-risk areas. But the damage was done. All eyes fell to Chinese President Xi Jinping, who, until this moment, had yet to face a mass movement of dissent before this. As he begins his third term, we want to take some time to look at why these protests were such a big deal and what the response to zero COVID might tell us about President Xi's legacy and the future of America's top rival on the global stage. First, any sort of open rebellion against the ruling party is highly unusual in China, especially against Xi himself.
Compared to the protests in China in the 1990s and 2000s, and we see a lot of protests, but many of these protests restrain themselves by targeting local officials and trying to express their loyalty to the center. But this time you see slogans chanting like Xi Jinping step down.
Well, my hometown is in Shanghai, and a lot of people in Shanghai, they joined this protest. They got arrested. This is the first time, actually, I've seen that Chinese people really stand out in public, saying we don't like the communist government. We hate Xi Jinping. We don't like these policies.
The economic impact of his unwavering zero COVID policies is a particular pain point for the president, whose early legacy was characterized by strong economic growth. Since Xi came to power in 2012, the country's GDP has more than doubled. The GDP had an average increase of almost 7% from 2013 to 2019. The president also made alleviating poverty one of his signature campaigns, spending hundreds of billions on aid and supplies and loans. In early 2021, he even declared complete victory over eliminating extreme poverty. Some analysts pointed out discrepancies in the figures the party presented, and users questioning the numbers were censored online. But thanks to the zero COVID policy earlier this year, China's economy shrunk for the first time since 1992. And earlier this year, the government chose not to announce a target GDP growth at all. This is coinciding with the collapse of the real estate market across China, as major developers were going bankrupt from too much borrowing. Housing prices are plummeting, many developing projects are abandoned before completion, and global investors are pulling out. Some Chinese officials have tried to cut lending rates and even tried buying homes directly to keep the industry afloat. About 30% of China's GDP is dependent on real estate. For comparison, one estimate puts real estate at only 17% of GDP in the US. The anger in China over the zero COVID policy is a big deal. Some have argued it's severely tarnished the legacy of Xi's strong economic growth. This may be ultimately why, for the first time since the pandemic began, he finally rolled back some of his zero COVID restrictions. But with the slowing economy and property crisis, Xi is facing an uphill battle going into his third term to project stability and growth for China's future. One group in particular is at the heart of the historic protests this past November, and that's been university students who've been left with a tough economy to graduate into. Our correspondent in Hong Kong, Richard Kimber, tells us more about what's driving China's next generation to push for changes.
It's only a couple of months since China's President Xi Jinping secured himself an historic third term in power at the head of the Communist Party at the country's National Congress. But political analysts say now is more important than ever for him to really stamp his authority on the party after an unprecedented series of public street protests in recent weeks, calling for an end to China's long-standing strict COVID-19 policies, and even in some cases for him to resign over his adherence to those policies. There's been a dramatic U-turn since then in China's official COVID-19 stance, and analysts say that's effectively empowered the public to believe they may now have more of a say than ever in terms of dictating China's political strategic future. That's particularly the case for economic analysts looking at the country's younger generation, with a near record 11 million graduates coming through their education system this year into an economy that simply doesn't have the capacity to absorb them because of how bad it's been hit by these strict COVID-19 policies. Major employers in the tech sector, particularly such as companies with long-standing growth stories such as Tencent and Alibaba, have been laying off employees right at the time when many graduates have been looking to those types of companies to build their future. That's not just because of COVID controls, but also because of a strict crackdown on the tech sector and other private sectors by the government this year in an effort to try and realign China's growth story with what President Xi Jinping has called a new strategy of common prosperity for all, rather than allowing big business to run away with themselves. This, though, is causing concern for the younger generation, who analysts say no longer feel the same sense of aspirational entrepreneurial opportunities in China as they may have done before the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's trying to balance that with record high youth unemployment right now. That's one of the major challenges for China in the coming months. And whether economists believe the overall growth story can get back to pre-pandemic levels next year is one thing, but whether that filters through to the younger generation's own belief system, whether or not they start to look increasingly towards opportunities overseas during a time when they're becoming increasingly globalized, is one of the major social challenges facing China's leadership. Richard Kimber for Newsy in Hong Kong.
All right, many thanks for that, Richard. We're going to take a quick break here, folks, but up next, we're getting into the holiday spirit with a little festive music. We're jamming out with you when you're back.